This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by writer and naturalist Matt Gaw to discuss his latest book, In All Weathers, a timely exploration of how weather shapes our landscapes, ecosystems, and personal experiences of the natural world. As we face an increasing onslaught of extreme and unpredictable weather patterns across the globe, Matt's reflections on walking through the elements, be it storm, drought or downpour, offer both a poetic and urgent perspective on our relationship with the forces that govern life on Earth. Listen on for a thought-provoking conversation on resilience, adaptation, and the beauty found in even the most inhospitable conditions.
So weather, I suppose, is something that we always talk about, isn't it, constantly? It's kind of in our language, in our greeting to each other. I think if you meet someone for the first time, you can either talk about football, but you can definitely talk about weather. And for me, I suppose it was really kind of in the summer of 22 that I started really thinking about this book. It was that really long summer when it just didn't rain. It was kind of like the heat just grew and grew and grew. It was like this physical presence almost that was lurked in rooms even after the sun had gone down. I just remember thinking, when will it rain? And then thinking, when was the last time you actually tried to go out in rain? And I was thinking about all of the times, I suppose really, in my life that I haven't gone out because the weather wasn't just right, or kind of, if it's not sunny, it's kind of written off as a bad day or something negative to be avoided. So I suppose I just kind of started thinking, well, we talk about weather all the time, but how much do we actually experience it? So that's where it started from, really. I kind of just thought, well, I want to dedicate a year to trying to change my mindset and experience different forms of weather and see what it felt like, what the actual experience was, but also kind of how it impacts on everything around us in terms of how it changes the light, how it changes the landscape, how different species react to it. And I suppose whether it is possible to change our mindset with weather as well.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that we try and hide from it a little bit. And I was thinking about myself, if it is dreary, then I just kind of go, oh God, it's like awful out and I'm just going to stay indoors. And I'm a real fair weather gardener nowadays. But because of that, I think that you probably intimate in the book that because we're not immersed in it, then maybe we just take it a little bit for granted and we're just not that aware of it anymore, are we, some of us?
Yeah, I think it is just that. I think, but also I don't want us to be beating ourselves up for not noticing, because kind of not noticing is kind of an evolutionary kind of tool, you know, kind of we're hardwired not to notice kind of things on the periphery, kind of the, you know, the falling of a leaf on the scud of a cloud and things like that. It's kind of almost, you have to, I suppose, kind of, you know, for our brains, it's about kind of not getting overwhelmed, our senses not getting overwhelmed. We're meant to focus on those things that are essential to our survival. But I think if we can kind of try and rewire ourselves, try and kind of take the time to notice, I think it's a really important step, because it kind of, you then become more in tune with time, and you become more in tune with the change of weather and the change of seasons. And I think you're then becoming part of that natural rhythm, and you're then more likely to notice when things don't fit with that. And I think really kind of we're, you know, I was saying that kind of as an evolutionary kind of thing that we don't notice for our survival, but I think now kind of we need to notice for our survival. It's about kind of noticing the changes and being much more in step with the natural world. And I think noticing weather is a really good doorway into that. It is the most universally accessed experience of nature. You know, all of us can experience weather.
And thinking specifically about the book, there were a few things that sort of struck me as I was reading it. And the first one was that you kind of repeatedly were trying to capture the experience of weather, but you didn't quite manage it. So whether that be you were trying to photograph it and you couldn't get the sort of human perspective, or you were trying to describe it to your children and you ended up like at one point playing music to communicate how you had felt about the experience of weather. Was that just kind of an observation, or was that almost like a subtle hint to people to get out in it because you can't experience it unless it's directly?
That's a really interesting question. No one's asked that before. And I don't think I'd even consciously thought about it. But I think it is that kind of, you do have to experience it. There's only so many similes in the world. And I probably had a similar experience when my previous book was about trying to kind of understand the night, looking at the problems going on, light pollution and things like that. And one of the things that we have with kind of dark skies is when people take photographs of it. And it kind of, the photographs of it kind of, often it'll be kind of like a really high exposure. So kind of it looks like absolutely fantastic, but it's not like the experience. And it's almost the other way with weather, kind of like, I think it's that moment with weather that it shifts from one thing to another. It's just always comes out so flat in photographs. I don't think you can kind of get that sense of being in the world in the same way that you are when you're actually there. There is a difference between experience and being outside looking in, I think. And yeah, I hadn't kind of intentionally kind of written it into the book like that. But yeah, I think experience is vital.
And the other thing that I was curious about, and it struck me as I went through the book, there was like a distinct lack of sunshine. So you started the book with a sunny period and then you finished it with one. But actually, essentially, the main part was kind of what we might think of as bad weather. Again, were you championing that bad weather and flying the flag for it and saying, actually, it's not bad, it's just different?
I think this is a tricky one because I think I definitely want to champion the bad weather. I'm using speech marks here and that kind of annoying, inclement weather we might kind of generally kind of think of as negative. But also there is kind of a shadow all the way through any discussion on weather when it comes, and that is climate change and climate crisis. I'm talking about kind of that, we need to be kind of experiencing bad weather, but then there are people having, floods and having life-threatening events. I'm not sort of saying that we should be going out and enjoying things like that. It's about kind of trying to be open to experiences of weather. In terms of not having the sun in there, I suppose it's kind of that idea of kind of, we've had that voice enough, that whole idea of kind of the joy of sunshine. But also, I suppose, when I was kind of thinking with the sun is that with climate change and climate crisis, like that summer of 2022, it was not a summer that you'd go out and enjoy. It was something that was, as gardeners would know, it was something that was challenging. It stopped growth. It stopped the bacteria in the soil from breaking down dead animals. It stopped life. It stopped everything. It was dangerous. It was scary. And it's kind of like, well, if the sun is something that could potentially become hostile, these sunny conditions that we've kind of traditionally held out for have been hostile, then we're going to need to be thinking about going out in different weathers. So I suppose there's an element of that to it as well. But I think, yeah, probably prime motivation was that kind of real simple, look, this is what we're missing. And there is joy to be had there as well. I think a lot of my books and a lot of my writing is about trying to inject a little bit of play back into the world, I suppose. I think that's something that I've really enjoyed, especially when I'm writing. That's something I really enjoy doing. And I think weather is something you can do with that, that kind of being a child again when you're chucking snow about, or when you're jumping about in a puddle, or, standing on a windy hill with your friends. I think as adults, we can sometimes forget to play and realize the importance of play. And I think weather can help us do that too.
Yeah, and I was thinking, actually reading it, that you did come across a lot of different types of weather and some of it was probably more enjoyable than others. But did you have a favourite type of weather going into writing the book, and did that change? Did you actually find a newfound appreciation for something or other?
Well, rain was kind of an interesting one in terms of kind of looking at kind of the chemical reactions that can cause, kind of in the same way that you feel good after you go to a beach or go to a waterfall. That's often because there's kind of this atmospheric kind of like negative ions in the air that's caused by the separating of molecules by moving water. And the same can be true with rain as well, like heavy rainfall. So sometimes you can actually, if you're in a rainstorm, rather than looking at it out the window, it can actually kind of be something that's really uplifting for your mood. I think as well as being a writer, I'm a teacher. So before the book, I was always kind of a little bit anti-wind. When I first started teaching, people were always kind of like, if the kids were misbehaving, which they do occasionally, they kind of sort of said, it's a windy day. It's windy. And I kind of thought there was a little bit nonsense, really. But experiencing wind, and like when we went to Nice Point on the Isle of Skye, which was a super blowy spot in mid-December, late December. We were like kids, kind of, we were just running around, whooping and hollering, and I couldn't work out what was going on, but kind of doing the research afterwards. And wind has this impact on the human body where it kind of is essentially almost under stress. But the first symptoms of that stress come out as euphoria. So I suppose my perception of wind definitely changed.
Yeah, that is a funny one. I mean, wind is really unsettling, actually. If you're out in it, it can be really discombobulating, and it certainly wouldn't be something I would seek out. But, as you went through the book, you've obviously kind of researched whether there's some really interesting stuff in there that you've probably found out along the way. But do you find that you're now better at reading weather patterns? Can you kind of predict what's coming up?
Yeah, in a really kind of simplistic way. I'm not a guru by any sorts. Like, I suppose for me as a writer, like my writing is kind of part of the process of finding out things. So I'm learning with the reader. But yeah, there's cloud tells, which, the more clouds that you've got, kind of the more unsettled the atmosphere, the lower the clouds, the closer the weather. I can tell kind of, by shape and movement and things like that. Nothing massive, but I think things that I didn't know and probably should have done. And maybe we should all kind of know in terms of that, just being in tune to our surroundings and what's going on, really.
So, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about weather whilst researching the book?
There's definitely some kind of surprising things about rain, or things that I didn't know. So, that the raindrop isn't tear-shaped, it's spherical unless it's a heavier rain, then it becomes like this burger-shaped. And there's some quite interesting facts around wind and research about wind. So meteorologists in the USA began to give storms name in the 1950s to make people more aware of it. And then in 1979, they started alternating those names. So rather than just having all men's names, they started alternating with men and women. But a study in 2014 at Princeton University suggested that it was the storms with the female names caused a lot more damage and definitely more injury and fatalities. And what they're thinking is that people were thinking that female storms are less threatening than a male storm, and they're not kind of getting out of the area. So, yeah, you're more likely to prepare for Storm Mark than a Storm Margaret.
That's so funny. And yet we persist with that system of naming.
Yeah, it's something, because we didn't have it in the UK, so it's been only recently kind of introduced in the UK. But yeah, it's all about trying to kind of increase awareness around storms and kind of make people, I suppose, kind of changing their behaviour in the face of weather, and that's something, unfortunately, we're probably going to have to get more used to.
Yeah, I liked how you said in the book, once you name something, people can kind of talk about it as an entity, and it just commands more attention, really. So, yeah, I thought that whole bit was fascinating. And then the other bit that you talked about, which I was really interested in, was how plants map the passage of weather and how you can kind of see it manifest in the landscape. Are there any sort of examples of that you can think of?
Well, that was kind of especially kind of when it comes to the kind of the cold patterns. And it's just where the frost lands and where the ice forms is very much kind of dependent on where different plants are. And when I was kind of up in the fens watching ice skaters, which was like an amazing experience, seeing these Fenland skaters, and some of them, these guys were quite old, and some of them were finding it difficult to walk. As soon as they hit the ice, they just transformed. And they were really good at mapping kind of the areas of kind of like looking at different dark patterns that might have been caused by where undergrowth is and where that might kind of cause problems with the ice. But also kind of like looking at that ice is more likely to be on kind of undergrowth rather than on bare soil. It's just looking at kind of the temperature differentials between those kind of two things. Yeah, I suppose it was just kind of, again, that noticing how the world is really kind of transformed by these things, especially when you kind of have something like a freezing fog and it just kind of lays down like these needles of ice, this rime ice. It can be really spectacular.
Yeah, the bit about the ice skaters was brilliant. I'd love to see them. It must be quite surreal, though, because I think it was quite dark when some of them were out.
Yeah. It's just the sound of it as well. It sounds like a knife being sharpened on a steel, and that's kind of what you hear first because the fence is so flat. Like whether, especially kind of, there was a lot of freezing fog about. Sometimes it's quite dark, but you could just hear the grind of these ice skates because they're going so fast as well. Because the ice can often be quite thin. It was only like 2 or 3 inches thick, the ice, but it's quite shallow water that it's over. But they're moving at some lick, and like the sound of it's just incredible, just going across this frozen landscape.
Yeah, sounds amazing. One of the questions that I had upon reading the book was, do you still enjoy the weather, or have you to some degree retreated back indoors out of it? And I wouldn't blame you if you had, to be fair.
There is some kind of contractual obligation, isn't there, to kind of like to anytime someone says it's miserable weather, to be like, no, it's beautiful. It has opened my eyes, to be honest. I enjoy being out in different weather a lot more than I would. I just think I wouldn't have gone out with it before. I'm running a lot now as well, so I really kind of enjoy going out in all weathers, especially like running in rain and things like that. It's just being present. When you run into rain or walk in rain, you feel the water everywhere. You feel it hitting you. You can't be anywhere else with that much. You can't really be thinking about anything else apart from that experience of rain hitting you. And I think it just, for me, it's quite meditative and kind of meant that I felt kind of really present in the world. And yeah, I don't know whether it's something to do with time as well, because I'm getting older. But you just kind of want to make the most of everything, really, kind of grab every kind of second that you have. And if we look back to kind of in terms of language, like weather was always yoked with time, like since the Garden of Eden, when weather and time came into being, it was tomp, kind of they are together. And there is that kind of, you notice weather, you notice time. And I think for me, it has that ability to kind of to slow life down a little bit, which is really, really welcome. But yeah, I do still go out. I think, sometimes I haven't got that kind of that spring in my step when I think, oh God, I'm not sure if I fancy going out in it today. And, I probably would kind of avoid going out for too long in a really windy situations. But I think, yeah, I've experienced kind of so many fun times and so many really memorable times with family and friends. I think that's what's been really lovely about this book as well. It's not just me going out, it's been going out with my kids as well, who are teenagers. So kind of getting an excuse to drag them outside. And again, it's coming back to that playing aspect, I suppose. It's kind of that being playful with them and being out in a weather that maybe they wouldn't expect to be out in. I found that really quite refreshing, actually.
A very big thank you to Matt for taking the time to talk to me. And thank you to you for listening. If you like this episode with Matt, I recommend checking out 191 Plants and People and episode 220, The Gardener's Almanac. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.